My father used to say that good ideas have feet, so I'm very glad to be here today. I brought 3 objects with me to help me tell my story. I'm going to tell 3 stories out of a collection of thousands of stories that I have helped collect in the last 2 decades. And these stories are difficult stories. Some of them are about atrocities and therefore difficult to swallow, and they remain unknown most of the time. And yet I believe that they are the key to our future. So I'm going to start with the first object. This is the story of, this symbolizes Rahim. Rahim was a 70-year-old former political prisoner from Palu, central Sulawesi, where Lian is from. And he was a political detainee. He was imprisoned in 1965. During that time, there was a wave of violence unleashed by the military against the Communist Party. It's a very long and complicated story, and some of it is unknown to us still. The facts are unknown. But suffice to say that a botched attempted coup by a group of soldiers thought to be linked, or said to be linked to the Communist Party, became the pretext for the killing of 1 million people, 500,000 to 1 million people. We still don't know how many people were killed. In fact, it's one of the ironies of Indonesia when you see this beautiful landscape around Bali and other places. There could be mass graves underneath it. In Bali alone, we know that about 80,000 people were killed during that time. Rahim was a young person, very enthusiastic. He taught literacy to the poor and then became involved in the Communist Party. So when this event happened in Jakarta, he had no idea what was happening, and he was picked up by the military. He considers himself one of the lucky ones because he was only imprisoned for 1 year. But during that time, he was made to work as a forced laborer. Did not get any pay, only on 1 ration of food a day, to build a stretch of road in Palu. After his release, he continued to have to report to the military personnel for another 12 years. So his children were expelled from school when they found out that their father was a former political prisoner, and on and on and on. I met Rahim in 2009 because he joined a victims group and that had begin to be collecting the stories of what happened to them. And if you see in the picture, there's a pile of papers. Rahim collected about 400 stories by himself, without anything, just with his spirit and his determination. And the whole group collected about 1,000 stories. This is only in 4 districts in central Sulawesi. Stories of killing, disappearances, torture, abuse, and also these 13 sites of public works that are still being used today. A dam, roads, buildings, even the park that were actually built by slave labor, the labor of the political detainees. And the public in Palu do not know this. But Rahim said to me, let's let history speak the truth. Oh. The second part of my story is this paddle, which is from Papua. And it symbolizes the story of Saras. Now, I'm having technical difficulties here. She experienced tremendous loss. In 1984, her husband, a Papuan member of the Indonesian army, deserted with a group of friends. And because of that, Saras had to report to the authorities for every day, bringing her 3 young children, all under the age of 4. She lost her house, and she also lost her possessions. During that time, she had a very difficult period. Her children fell ill. 2 of her children actually died because she wasn't able to get the medications that she needed for her children. And she was always blamed in her community for whatever happened because she was thought to be a troublemaker. In 1987, her husband rowed a small canoe to come and visit her. The reunion was very, very short. They were found out. She ran to the forest. There was some fighting, and eventually her husband was captured. She heard later on that he was killed, and in fact his head was decapitated. And she heard that her husband's head was brought into town as some sort of sick souvenir of war. In October that same year, Sarah went to a development fair in her little community. It's one of those fairs where the government organizes stalls to show the fruits of development. And she was so shocked to see that in one of the stalls there was a picture of her husband. And a family member came up to her and said, "Don't go in there because your husband's head is on display." And she said she didn't go in, but it felt like a knife pierced my heart. So Sarah lives in her village now. She still is very poor. She says she can't get access to development projects because of the discrimination that she experiences. And she carries this really, really heavy secret in her heart. This year, I've been involved with a group of human rights workers in Papua, trying to record some of these stories about this difficult past. And for many victims, the past is not past. We are finding people with scars and shrapnel and stories that are unimaginable. When we asked Sarah to draw a symbol for her story, she drew that canoe. That brought her husband back to her, even for a moment. The third object I've brought is this flower. And this flower reminds me of a bed of flowers that we planted, that a woman planted in Timor, East Timor, in a former prison that we converted into the office of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the CAVR, back in 2002. The young woman, her name was Mise. She was a political prisoner there, or a detainee there, when she was 5 years old. I mean, imagine that. I was very lucky to have worked at the East Timor CAVR, a commission that was tasked to seek the truth about what happened in East Timor between 1975 until 1999. So we collected 8,000 stories of victims. We conducted community reconciliation meetings, and we held what we call public hearings, a little bit like this space that we have here now. One of the most haunting stories that I heard was the story of Mise. It was in 1977. Her mother was a nurse taken by the military police, tortured because for some reason they thought that she had some important information. Initially, Mise, when she told the story, she said, I wasn't tortured, until one of the other children in prison started talking about some secrets that his father had. And then the military thought, oh, this is a good way to get information. Let's just torture the children, because the children will speak in their innocence. So she too began to be tortured. So during the public hearing, she spoke, she didn't shed a tear. She was so strong and brave, talking about the torture that she and her mother experienced. But then she broke down and cried at a really interesting moment, which is a little story about how she was made to bring a bowl of red bean soup to her mother, who was tied up in the courtyard in the middle of the prison under the heat of the sun. And instead of feeding it to her mother, she was told to pour it on her head. So she broke down and cried, and so did all of us in the room at the time. So we looked at all these stories, analyzed each of them, trying to understand what happened and how and why. Out of those stories, we recommended a reparations policy to help victims try to overcome the suffering of the past. Mise was a young policewoman when she came to the commission, starting a career with a special victims unit, very appropriately. And she heard that we needed somebody to help plant a garden in the former prison. And so she planted some flowers in the memory of her mother. So let me go back to these three objects: stone, paddle, and flower. To me, the stone symbolizes truth, the foundation, the bedrock for us to build a better future. As much as we try to push the skeletons into our closets, avert blame, swallow our pain and our hatred, actually the truth will surface. It might take another generation, but it will. When massive crimes take place, there needs to be a special effort to acknowledge and understand the truth. The evidence is usually strong and compelling despite despite people trying to hide it. And the memory of these crimes are passed on by victims to their children. But the truth that I'm talking about is also a bit different because it relates to systematic crimes. These were acts, criminal acts that were not just individual, unrelated, random acts. These were acts that were happening everywhere, every day, at a large scale. The people that were supposed to be protecting you were actually committing these crimes towards you. There was a plan dreamed up and discussed somewhere and resourced by a group of people. And on the other side, there was a group of people who became passive bystanders, people who allowed these crimes to take place by being silent. That's why we have to speak out now. Each story, thousands of victims of these systematic crimes, is like a stone waiting to be unearthed, to be understood, and to be acknowledged. Some 40 countries now around the world have had truth commissions. The CAVR in East Timor is one of them. Indonesia had plans to have a truth commission, but the plan was made and then abandoned. So now victims and civil society groups are planning our own truth-telling process. And I hope you can help us and join us in this process. The paddle. There needs to be a lot of planning and resources to commit crimes at a massive scale. An efficient engine needs to be at work. So at the end of conflict, at the end of an authoritarian regime, it takes a lot of time and energy to try to dismantle that engine. And it's actually a very difficult task because most governments just want to say, let's just move forward because, let's forget the past and just move forward. And they're much happier not to listen to the stories of victims. When we stare at those stories, we'll see that there's going to be some important patterns. For example, a corrupt bureaucracy, a weak judiciary, a system where you can bribe everybody and get payoffs, a system where you can use thugs and militias to make happen a political objective, a system where civilians are seen just as collateral damage so they can be sacrificed, or a place where violence and intimidation is used to deal with dissent instead of dialogue and discussion. In fact, some of the leaders perhaps have to be brought to court, to trial, and perhaps disallowed to hold public office. So those are the lessons from Saras' story. The paddle that her husband used for his canoe can help us steer our way out of the murky waters. Because if we don't learn from the lessons from the past, we will be very easily pushed back into the currents of the past. And lastly, the flower. It symbolizes, of course, a new beginning, regrowth, hope. When mass violations take place, there is an obligation to help repair the life of victims. And this is an obligation that all governments have. And us as well, society. We have that obligation as well, especially if we have been silent about these atrocities in the past. Sometimes the process for healing for victims may take decades. Sometimes it happens right away, but most often it takes a long time because victims are powerless, they're voiceless, and they're almost invisible. And how do you have to try to imagine, how do you recover from torture? How do you recover from loss? The kind of loss that Saras and Musa and Rahim had experienced. It's not easy, but there are some good examples. The government needs to acknowledge the past, acknowledge the suffering, and develop programs that can help victims recover so that they can get some kind of material and symbolic benefit so that they can get a leg up and participate in a free nation as empowered citizens. So what is my message? Well, join me and others in this quest for truth, reform, and repair. Ask questions about these difficult truths. Ask your neighbors. Ask the people that are around in your life. Help us preserve these stories. Right now, we're just writing them down. We don't have the technology to do videotapes, etc. That is actually also what we need to do. And help us make that commitment to change. And I think more importantly, reach out to victims because they are there and they have the right to be just like us. They have the right to be whole again. Sometimes my friends say to me, you know, what you're doing is too hard. You're looking at these sad stories. We're just going to look ahead. Why are you keeping on looking at the past? And I say to her, well, actually, it's actually because I'm looking to the future that I strongly believe that we need to look at our past with an open heart and our open eyes. Thank you.